Today we have the Overwatch abilities visualized for every hero using the workshop mode to really make you go, wow, that's really big and long. Seeing all these visualized will not only be interesting, but will help you understand how to play around certain abilities a little bit more carefully. There's no video sponsor today except for the blood, sweat, and tears of all the volunteers from the ELO Hell workshop community who run a very active Discord and their workshop.codes website that catalogs everything you want to play in the Overwatch custom games community. Big shout out to these guys, Darwin, Dragon Engineer, Lato, Mitzi, Plus or Minus, Urod, and Cactus Puppy for putting this entire guidebook together that will further explain the modes after I showcase them in the video if you're interested in trying out the workshop mode yourself. This of course will be linked in the description below. Let's start with D.Va. We have Plus or Minus's HITBOX Playground. This shows you the true defense matrix range and, well, have a good look. These metal beams enclose the box in which projectiles will be deleted starting from the front of the mech's cockpit as long as D.Va has direct line of sight. Meaning, if the matrix sticks through some walls, it will not eat the projectile. What else is interesting is that using this visualizer, we can see the matrix is rectangular as opposed to the in-game real visual, which sort of has the shape of a frustum. Therefore, when in-game, you can't sneak any projectiles past this part. Next we have Urod of the Grandeur Hammers, and the D.Va Bomb Trainer I actually featured back in the workshop video, which is supposed to be a tool that helps you come up with new bomb angles. Press melee to see the visualized range of the damage drop-off zones from the explosion. Anyone in this ring would take 1000 damage, anyone here would be 600 damage, and anyone here is about 200. Anything beyond this, damage ramps down linearly until you're completely out of range as indicated with the damage tracker in the middle. And now for D.Va's gun, we have Mitzi who put together the Baby D.Va's pistol bullet size. I know the Overwatch community has probably thought it was always very large and forgiving, and now you can see how big these really are. You can hit enemies between their legs, far off their hero model, but for this mode, as long as the blue sphere touches, it counts. For Orisa, we have Darwin's original range tool that was updated by Cactus Puppy to account for the range nerf to its current 4 meter radius. Honestly, it still looks pretty big. It's hard to believe that it used to be 7 meters at one point, and you wondered why it was so OP back in the day. Next we have Plus or Minus's improved nade tool, which has a really accurate projectile equation to visualize and predict your shields wherever you throw it. This one's more of a practice tool, but I thought it was really cool and wanted to show you guys since it also has a chase camera. And finally, we go back to Mitzi's visualizer, and you can see Orisa's bullets are quite thin and skinny, at least when compared to what we saw earlier for Baby D.Va's pistol. And that's the point of this visualizer video, to really see these minor differences between each hero. For Rein, this is Plus or Minus's melee hitbox playground, which covers all parts of Rein including the Earthshatter, the swings, and the charge. Let's start with Earthshatter. This visualizer shows you the pie or cone-shaped range of it. The aqua-colored ring that pulsates represents the shatter hitbox, which expands or propagates forward like a wave, meaning that enemies near the end of the range get shattered later than enemies at the beginning. Next we have Rein's swings visualized with these spheres which light up as the swing animation goes through. The most interesting takeaway is that you can already begin making contact with enemies in the first frame of starting a swing up here, even if the hammer is still on the far side. Like, look at the space in between. And then the swing hitbox actually travels across Rein's body very fast, like way before the swing even crosses the midpoint. That's why the very common Rein tip of moving your camera across the side you're swinging can extend and help make contact with your enemies. And finally, we have the charge. The gray metal beams give the rough initial point where enemies get pinned, and the gray sphere indicates the hitbox for the boop portion where they don't get sucked in and pinned. Both the hitbox, the boop, and pin itself changes over time and is not shown in game because it's actually really complicated. Finally, we head back to Mitzi's projectile mode to see the actual Fire Strike hitbox. Turns out this thing is a giant sphere, so don't feel too bad for being a Fire Strike magnet and constantly being hit by it. It's hard to dodge. For Roadhog, we are back with Plus or Minus's melee hitbox. What you're seeing here with the gray spheres is the visualized range of the hook. Whenever you hook someone, each yellow sphere indicates which part of the hook hitbox is active during the animation. The hook animation itself is faster than the true hitbox, but you probably won't notice it in-game since it all happens really quickly, but is still quite an interesting find nonetheless. Now, another cool visualizer available for Roadhog is seeing his secondary fire scrap gun sweet spot made by Darwin. The white ring represents where the pellets will fully explode and burst out. I suggest walking around on some common teamfighting spots to get a feel for where you can get maximal damage. For example, on King's Row here, defending teams often play around this corner, so now, while I play Hog, I know I need to take a few steps forward around my corner here to maximize my damage. For Sigma's Kinetic Grasp, plus or minus got us covered again. This ability has a much smaller horizontal length when compared to D.Va's Matrix, but is still deceptively long considering how powerful the ability actually is. Because Sigma is humanoid and not a giant mech like D.Va, his hero hitbox has a lot more gaps to eat projectiles from behind. In plus or minus's other mode, he visualized the Gravitic Flux hitbox, which looks a little intimidating at first, but is actually quite simple. The long cylindrical visualizer represents the radius of the flux, which is fairly accurate to the in-game cursor they give you when you first activate the ultimate. And as soon as you select where you want to flux, another visualizer comes up, this time a half sphere or dome, which represents the maximum height you can pick an enemy up with as long as there is direct line of sight to the center. Easiest way to understand it is to just look at this comparison. In this example, Lucio is just barely outside the dome visualizer. And in this example, the flux hits because Lucio's hitbox intersects with the dome, simple as that. And plus or minus's nade tool, of course, also covers the Sigma rock, which you can use to visualize where you want to throw it and practice them for your games. Next we have Winston, and plus or minus has visualized his Tesla cannon as indicated by the metal beams. Looks kind of intimidating, but if we zoom out and change the camera angle, we can see that the Tesla cannon is a giant cone that will zap enemies within it. Some people in the past have thought this was a lock-on, but it's just simply a very large ability hitbox. This mode also showcases the Primal Rage melee, which follows a similar pattern to Reinhardt. That means if you want to ensure you hit an enemy, you should be slightly shifting your camera side to side, matching the arm that's swinging to extend the hitbox. Another observation is that the vertical height of the hitbox isn't that big, and since Winston has to consistently leap, it's important to be looking down as you leap to make sure that the melee actually connects on an enemy, since it's very easy to overshoot the jump and miss your target. For Ball, we have his adaptive shield range visualized by Darwin by this yellow and purple ring. The purple ring is supposed to represent the adaptive shield range, where additional enemies standing within it would grant Ball's additional shields. The yellow ring indicates the range of the Piledriver's impact damage, which is the exact same. Coincidentally, the Minefield also happens to be roughly the same, so he's got 3 abilities in the same range. So now that you can see it visualized, really get a good feel for this and you will probably pop off and climb as Ball. For Zarya, we have plus or minus's improved nade tool visualizing the estimated parabolic arc of her secondary fire and Graviton surge. Fun fact, they are exactly the same, so in a real game situation, if you're unsure of where your grav is going to go, shoot a secondary fire first to test it. If you activate the chase camera on this mode, you can actually see the visualized explosion radius. The light blue is the secondary fire, which is kind of small, and the grab is the dark blue, which is much bigger, and the range in which the enemies would get sucked in. First one for Ashe is plus or minus's projectile visualizer, once again that predicts the Dynamite arc for you to practice on, and it has the size of the Dynamite visualized, which looks pretty big. That's very cool. Next is Cactus Puppy's damage fall off tool to see where Ashe's damage tapers off in a visualized format. You're going to press interact to open a menu to mark a starting spot like the top of the gas station here on Route 66. Then you'll see a blue ring, which first represents the range of 30 meters where any enemies within it are close enough to take full damage from her gun, which is 75 for a body shot or 150 for a headshot. Now the red ring out here represents the maximum fall-off range of 50 meters. So any enemies beyond this takes a minimum damage of 37.5 for a body and 75 for a headshot. And then any enemies between the red and the blue ring, aka the 30 and 50 meter range, will take a scaled reduction in damage depending on the distance. So for example, if you mark an endpoint, the mode will calculate the distance from the starting point, and in this example, it's 35.1 meters away, meaning her body shots for any enemy standing exactly here will take 65.45 damage or 130.89 for a headshot. The numbers between aren't as important, but the visualized blue and red ranges are important, so that you know that you need to position yourself close enough to enemies where your damage doesn't ramp down too much due to fall off. For Bastion's visualizer, Mitzi's tool covers the explosion radius of his ult with this giant red sphere. The direct rocket itself is that tiny blue sphere, and you can see how much harder it is to hit it direct, so it is generally advised to go for the reliable splash hits with the radius like that. For Doomfist, we have plus or minuses mode once again, and right away we've got a really cool observation from visualizing his uppercut. This blue sphere is the uppercut hitbox, which is way bigger than you'd think it would be intuitively when looking at the uppercut animation. The entire lower half of Doomfist's body and beyond his feet are part of the hitbox, which definitely explains why you can still land your uppercuts on enemies despite being on a much higher altitude. Now this mode also visualizes Doom's Meteor Strike ultimate. The number over the Baptiste's head here is the damage the Meteor Strike will do, which is around 15 to 200 on the outer ring that scales depending on the distance, then jumps to about 300 damage in the center. But with the visualizer, there's a very important observation made. If you're able to have some form of mobility, you can always guarantee your life, as Baptiste for example, because if you time your jump, you will always guarantee survival depending on how high you jumped and how far away you were from that red center. What's even cooler is that if you preemptively time your jump as Baptiste, you will be at the peak of your jump and be out of the entire half sphere damage range of the Meteor Strike completely if you do it ahead of time like so. For Echo, we have a new author this time, Lotto, who has visualized the Tri-Shot primary fire and the focusing beam. Both abilities are fairly straightforward in terms of their hitbox matching the visuals, nothing to really note here. Now onto Mitzi's tool, we can actually see the Sticky Bomb Visualizer. If you stick an enemy, this small blue hitbox here needs to intersect with the enemy's hero hitbox, which may be a bit difficult if they're constantly moving. However, the giant red sphere here is the explosion radius, which is massive and has a flat 25 damage as long as enemies are within it. The damage does not change the further they are away from the center like Doomfist, so it's super easy to do tons of damage to grouped up enemies. For Genji, this is again plus or minuses hitbox playground. Checking out the Deflect hitbox visualizer. From the front, everything deflects within the metal beams. However, it has quite a unique shape because it gives Genji protection on his sides. Whether or not he will deflect it depends on the angle between the direction he's looking at and the direction of the incoming projectile. If the angle is greater than 90 degrees, then Genji will deflect and you'll get situations like this. If the math is a little too complicated to understand, use this mode and check the UI information given here. The dot output must be negative and the angle must be greater than 90 degrees for the attacks to be deflected. So pay attention here, less than 0 on the dot, greater than 90 degrees, it deflects. Now I slightly change the projectile angle and now it doesn't deflect. For his other mode, this one shows the DragonBlade hitbox, which is a giant cone, which is pretty neat. That means you can look really high above an enemy and still connect the slash. Lotto's mode here showcases the swift strike through these green spheres, which look quite big, but it kind of makes sense for how reliable the ability is when dashing through a group of enemies. And finally, we have Mitzi's mode here to show the Shuriken size, which is also quite reasonable. Definitely not as forgiving as Baby D.Va's like we saw earlier. For Hanzo, we have the giant caterpillar of death from plus or minus. Now, an interesting discovery here is that there are two damage zones. The outer layer in blue, which deals only 150 DPS, and the inner layer in red, which deals 300 DPS. That means tanks like Roadhog can literally tank the entire outer half of the dragon if the angle of it was shot poorly. If you're in the dragon center, the red spheres, you will die so much faster because the damage is doubled. Now what's even more interesting is that the inside red circle part of the dragon only does 300 DPS if it intersects with an enemy's feet or bottom of their hitbox. If not, they will only take damage from the outer blue layer, which is again 150 DPS. So you can see here the Hog is just tanking it, even though it looks like the center is going through it. I mean, it is going through it, but it's just not connecting to the bottom of his character. If you aim the dragon lower and make sure the red spheres are clearly going through and touching the Hog's feet, he gets completely melted. The takeaway here is that if you're going to go for a grab dragon combo, for example, it's much more reliable to aim the dragon lower than higher to ensure that they take the full 300 damage per second. For Junkrat, we have Mitzi's mode again, showing you the size of the grenade's hitbox for a direct with the blue sphere and the explosion radius as the red sphere. No surprises here, just look at it. Try not to play too close together with your team against a Junkrat, or else that explosion damage will really rip your team apart. For McCree, we have his flashbang range, first visualized by Darwin almost 2 years ago and was one of the main inspirations for this video, and now it's updated by plus or minus here. I think this is one of the biggest eye-opening visualizers in this video because having a reliable stun with the range like this, along with that HP buff, made him arguably OP as of April 2021. I mean, the proof is in the pudding. Using the same hit scan visualizer from Cactus Puppy, we can also see McCree's fall-off range. Similar to Ashe earlier, set a starting point and check out the blue and red domes to see the visualized drop-off zones. McCree does 70 for a body shot, 140 for a head. The first fall-off area begins at 20 meters, which looks something like this. And on Hanamura, if you play here, 20 meters is right in front of the choke. Between the blue and red ring is the 20 to 40 meter range, where it slowly lowers until you reach the red ring, where the damage is at its minimum of 35 for a body shot and 70 for a head. For Mei, there isn't much to visualize, so we have her icicles here through Mitzi's tool to verify if they're truly accurate to the projectile. A little bigger than I expected, but otherwise it looks fine. For Pharah, Mitzi's tool again shows us the direct rocket hitbox as the tiny blue sphere and the explosion radius as the red one. The splash damage from the explosion scales depending on how close the enemy is to the center instead of being a flat rate, so keep that in mind. Looks good to me. What's interesting though is that we also have the concussive blast visualizer here, and this one is a big surprise. Like, look how big the range is. The knockback appears to be at a fixed distance as long as enemies are within it. It doesn't change. Good stuff. Next, we have Reaper, and Darwin visualized his Death Blossom range with this blue ring. It looks like it's pretty much the size of most capture points, which helps justify why Reaper is very good on maps where fights are centralized on a single point. For Soldier, we have Mitzi's tool like we've seen many times now, with the blue sphere as the direct and red sphere as the explosion radius. It looks very similar to Pharah's rocket, but obviously has a much higher projectile velocity. The explosion damage also scales here, so enemies take less damage the further out they are, and more damage the closer they are to the direct center. Cactus Puppy's fall-off tool can again be used here to visualize Soldier's damage. He does 19 damage per bullet, 38 for a headshot. If we mark a starting point here, for example, on Nepal, enemies within this blue ring of 30 meters will do the full damage. 30 to 50 meters is outside here, and that's where it starts scaling downwards. And now you can see if I place an endpoint here, it's now 18 damage per bullet. And then once beyond 50 meters, way in the back with the red ring, it would be 9.5 damage. For Sombra, the most important range for her to know is 15 meters. And visualized, this is what 15 meters looks like. This is a 3-in-1 package because this visualizer represents the number 1, EMP range, number 2, the sound of the beeping translocator, as in people outside of this can't hear it anymore, and number 3, the range of the unstealth sound where she goes "Que onda" or "Be near all along." Here's Dragon Engineer's version of it, looks a bit more clearer here. For Symmetra, Darwin's mode here showcases the estimated range of the photon beam, and it visualizes the sentry turrets like so. The range of these things is really big when you see it like this, and any areas where it cross sections is where enemies would get tagged by multiple turrets. Not much else to this one. For Torb, we have plus or minus his nade tool, which visualizes multiple parts of his kit. The first is his turret range, outlined with this long, dark blue sphere. So for example, the turret up top, the elevator here, can see and shoot people just at the entrance of the choke, but it does allow enemies to poke at it from afar without being shot back. Alternatively, another popular spot is behind the back stairs here, which covers the entire point and is harder for the enemies to see. When in first person, the red dot represents your rivet gun, your primary fire, and how it sinks down due to gravity, and the big light blue sphere is the estimated landing spot of your Torb ult. Of course, since we're on the nade tool, you can follow and see where your load lands to make sure you're not shooting blanks. For Tracer, let's start with her pulse bomb by plus or minus. I'm sure looking at it visualized right now is making you go wow, because that was my initial reaction seeing it. So don't feel too bad if you accidentally walk into a bomb without actually being stuck by it. The damage of the explosion does lower the further you are away from the center, but most people are able to get out of the way completely since it takes a few seconds for it to explode and you get that little indicator. Cactus Puppy's tool also covers Tracer's fall-off damage from her pulse pistols. Fall-off begins at around 12 meters now, and if we set a starting spot, it's around here. To put it into perspective, a blink is around 7.5 meters, but you're constantly going to be holding a movement key in the blink direction, and that little extra 4.5 meters isn't that much. Fall-off damage matters a lot on Tracer because it affects each individual pellet, so it is very noticeable once enemies are outside that initial blue range. So as long as you kind of play within that first blink range, you should be good to go. For the last DPS Widowmaker, we have Cactus Puppy's tool for the final time to visualize and determine the fall-off damage. Yes, if you missed it or haven't played Overwatch for a while, they did attempt to nerf Widowmaker by finally giving her fall-off damage, starting at 60 meters up to 85 meters back in August 2020. However, in most cases, you really aren't going to be sniping anyone past that range because 60 meters is still very far on most maps. I have a few examples to show you. First is Junkrat Town. If you snipe from here, 60 meters is the end of the blue sphere here, and it slowly starts ramping down as you keep going past it. If I set an endpoint, this spot specifically compared to the original spot is about 68.54 meters, meaning it's about 99 for a body and 248 damage for a headshot. Most squishies still would be killed. Havana third phase is another popular Widow spot up in this window. Fall off is around here. Honestly, no difference. Widow will still dominate this point. Ilios Ruins. Now here's where fall off is more significant if you decide to play up here. Dueling another Widow here in the exact same spot on the opposite side of the map is almost pointless because the maximum damage you can do for a fully charged headshot is 150. Not enough to kill her. You are, however, still doing full damage to anyone playing the point, but still really cool to know. For Ana, let's begin with Mitzi's mode again to see the projectiles visualized. First, her weapon. The shots look quite reasonable considering her bullets are small. Now for the sleep dart, you'd also think the dart is small, but look at the size of the giant hitbox here. I mean, this ability is a very long cooldown, so I suppose Blizzard made it super forgiving, so it's extra satisfying when you land a clutch sleep. We also have the nade impact and splash radius here, but we can switch over to plus or minus's nade tool, which was the original purpose of the mode to begin with before he advanced it to cover all the other heroes as well. Same thing as before, you can use it to visualize and practice your nades. There's a chase cam and the visualize splash radius. For Baptiste, Mitzi's mode shows that the bullets of his primary fire have a realistic and very small hitbox. In plus or minus's mode, we can see the healing grenade splash radius, which is a flat amount of healing within that blue sphere, and that little red dot is the direct. The fact that this splash radius is so big is one of the main reasons why BAP is so good in Orisa comps where teammates clump up together. It's just so easy to shoot the ground and heal everyone. Additionally, if you didn't know, the Baptiste Immortality Field has the exact same projectile arc as the healing grenades, so if you're ever unsure of where it's going to land, test it with the secondary fire first. After you throw the lamp, this mode also visualizes the big cylindrical coverage of it as long as you have line of sight. For Brig, Darwin's tool uses multiple rings to indicate all her important abilities. First one we'll look at is the red ring here, which represents the estimated range of her swings. If we turn around and look at the far yellow ring, this represents the range of her Inspire passive healing for her teammates. As long as any allies are within this range, they will slowly be healed as long as you land a swing or whip shot to proc it. If I'm fighting a Rein here at this part of the choke, my teammates back at that mega are gonna get healed because they're within range. And similarly, the whip shot is the exact same range as that Inspire healing, so it's a good reference to use if you're ever curious if teammates are in range to be healed. Finally, this blue ring is the rally range for teammates to receive armor. The range is much smaller than her passive, but just slightly bigger than her swing range. For Lucio, plus or minus's playground mode covers his boop ability in a lot of detail. The metal beams here show that the sound wave is a cone shape with a very long range. Doesn't really look like it in first person, so it's cool to see it visualized like this. Try to think of its range like a Winston Tesla cannon. It's got very far coverage above and below Lucio's sightlines. It is important to remember that the angle in which you boop enemies changes how they're knocked back. If you boop from under, looking up, the enemies will go higher vertically, and conversely, if you boop downwards, they will go more in a line drive. Lucio's primary fire in Mitzi's mode demonstrates the projectile size, which looks accurate to the projectile. Nothing else to this one. For Mercy, we have Darwin's mode here showing the estimated Guardian Angel ranges. The purple ring is the minimum distance a teammate must be, and the green ring is the maximum distance a teammate must be. The red sphere in the middle is the maximum distance her beam can reach. For Moira, Lato went all out in this mode to visualize her abilities. Let's start with the Biotic Grasp primary fire, the healing. Every time you use it, a constant refreshing puff of healing will come out. And if you tap it really quickly, you can see it looks like this. And if I hold it, it looks like that. The biggest takeaway here is that if you really want to hard pocket and heal someone, you should be holding your heal on them to be constantly refreshing that healing puff non-stop. If you see a group of your teammates and you decide to swing your crosshairs left and right, you will be able to heal the group collectively, but the raw healing potency on an individual target will be much lower. You'll notice how some of them will inevitably miss if you aim it like this. Now, there's a common myth out there that Moira's secondary fire has an auto lock on to targets, or a soft lock. This is false, and what's interesting is that through this visualizer, Lato has determined that certain Moira abilities, her Grasp and Coalescence, respond to enemies through a custom capsule. On the wall here are all the potential size of enemy HITBOX capsules. I think the reason they did this is because this is a beam with 0 width, which only means it can do damage if it intersects with these bad boys. The maximum range of it is indicated by this purple ring here. This is what the healing orb looks like, and this is what the damage orb looks like. Healing orb seems to be a little bit bigger than the damage orb, and both of these need to intersect with an actual hero hitbox, not a capsule, in order to activate. Coalescence, on the other hand, as indicated by the metal beams here, does need to intersect with the hero's capsule to do both damage or to heal an ally. It's a lot of back and forth between capsule versus hitbox, so to simplify things, Lato gives you a nice summary text on the wall right when you load into this mode. If you're a Moira main, I highly recommend just checking this out to further your understanding of this hero. The last hero of Overwatch 1, Zenyatta. We have the range tool from Darwin showing you the range of the Harmony and Discord orb, which is the exact same. It's really far, but what's more important to remember as a Zen player is that this is simply the orb application range. Once an orb is on an ally or enemy, as long as there is direct line of sight between the orb and the Zen, it will not disappear. Mitzi's mode is the last visualizer in this video, showcasing the Zen orb primary and secondary fire hitbox size. They are very, very true to the in-game projectile size. No surprises here. That's all for the visualizer video. Not every single ability needed one, but I think we covered most of the important ones for each hero. Thanks for watching. Support the workshop authors, join the Elo Hell Discord, and I'll see you guys next time.